So I did a video a few days ago about naturalism because I was reading Hofstadter's book and I wanted to um, get into the historical context of naturalism. So I went back to the Enlightenment really and looked at Galileo and Bacon and how their methods they built the scientific method and they built the lens through which science views the world per se. And I didn't really. I mean, I think I talked about Descartes a little bit, but um, I wanted to go back even further today. Um, and I did mention Plato and Aristotle a little bit in that last video too. Um, but I've been reading this book called Sources of the Self by Charles Taylor, and he's trying to ground ethics on something legitimate and stable once again because he thinks that right now we're in this postmodern uh, phase of morality where everything is seems subjective because science has separated the world um, into these differing spheres. Um, the big three, the I, we, and the it perspectives, have all separated, but the we is sort of a byproduct of the I and the it working together in a an efficient manner. And so when they're not working together, when they're conflicting, as it seems they are nowadays, the we, the community, the society seems to fall apart because there's no intersubjectivity. There's no meaningful communication. Everybody, nobody, because nobody will agree on what the truth is anymore. Everybody is raised really to be such an individual that at the end of the day, your opinions matter more than what anybody else tells you. Whether that's an authority figure, whether it's a scientific textbook, whether it's a Bible, whether it's your friend, you're always taught to have your own ideas. And that's not, I mean, this is a value that lots of cultures have held throughout human history, but it's never been quite as extreme as ours. Because, I mean, while obviously it's a good thing to think for yourself, if you think for yourself too much, then you won't fit into any communities. You won't be able to engage others meaningfully. You won't be able to consider a larger world space and existence than just your own egotistical perspective. And I mean, when we look at the stuff like Einstein's relativity in science and quantum physics, and the hardest of the sciences is now it's so relative. There's no particles anymore. It's all waves, and all these physicists now are turning into these new age gurus who make movies like What the Bleep Do We Know, and they start these spiritual movements based on physical theories about the nature of matter. And so even science now is putting its hands up in the air and saying it's all your projection, basically. Like, it's all, the observer and the observed are one. And it's not necessarily, I mean, I agree with that, but it doesn't mean that your opinion, I mean, it doesn't mean that you go around picking opinions that pleasure you, or just taking from the world what you like about it. That's not necessarily what that implies. That's how it's being interpreted by the popular culture. Um, but this understanding of who we are as people has a historical context, and I think um, Hofstadter is fitting into this commonsensical idea. At least today, it's common sense that this is the way a self is. This is the way a brain cognizes, if you want to use the naturalistic language. And so Hofstadter, although he's a scientist trying to give an objective description of how the physical structure of the brain operates, he's still projecting his cultural sense of himself onto that structure because for him that's who he is. His I is a physical process, a loop in his brain, a feedback loop. And so obviously whatever, I mean, whatever his human experience of himself is, based on his cultural surroundings and his social context, that's what he's going to project onto the structure of the brain, because he can't interpret his experience any other way. And the point is, it's basically his phenomenological perspective on reality has a historical context right now, because it's all of society's perspective right now, just because of the way thought develops. I mean, so like, if we go back even before Descartes, the dualism between mind and matter, it was even in Augustine. Um, in Charles Taylor, this book talks about how Augustine mentioned the cogito at least 13 times in his philosophical works, and it was identical to Descartes' proof, almost. I mean, it was basically the only thing I can't doubt is my own consciousness, and that's how the whole theory of representationalism got started with Augustine, 2,000 years ago. Because basically, when you start to say the only thing that I can't doubt is myself, well, then Descartes takes that and says, well, therefore I can only think that my representations of the world are true if they are so close to myself. There is such evidence to believe them that I can no longer doubt that they are myself. I have connected with them. I have knowledge of them. I know them in their objective being. So I no longer have to doubt them. So that's why we have to represent the world. The objective world has to be translatable into the brain processes so that our body can actually feel the truth out there. Otherwise, it would be doubtful. So there has to be this layer, in other words, between sensation and perception. And I think Merleau-Ponty talks about this a lot. I really have to go back and read it because I wasn't applying it to Hofstadter while I was reading it, so I didn't quite make these connections that I'm making now. But he was, I think, Merleau-Ponty was really critical of that distinction between sensation and perception, because it's such to try to our intelligence would be so good at projecting this distinction onto the world whenever it was interpreting something that it's really difficult to tell the difference between when sensation happens first and when perception happens second. Like perception could happen first, and that could be defining what we categorize sensation as. And it's like, well, how do we ever tell the difference? And so he wanted to that's basically the Heideggerian distinction between the object in itself and the object as perceived. The object in itself would be what we sense, right? And the object as perceived would be a representation of it. And obviously representations can be mistaken, and so this starts the whole game of science. But when that game is our basis for truth claims, including truth claims about what's good in life, because today the common sense idea is that truth and goodness are the same thing, right? If something is good, it must be true. Otherwise, it's not true. And science has the monopoly on truth. And so if science says that we can't talk about certain goods, that love is more than a chemical reaction in the brain, that it's actually this metaphysical connection between people. If science can't make a claim about that, and in fact, if science makes a claim about that, a negative claim about that, and says that's not a good because that's false, and by teaching that, this is what an extreme scientific materialist atheist would say. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins. He would say these metaphysical claims are not only unprovable, untestable, but they're false. And he has a whole social moral philosophy to add after that falsity, and to say that science can lead us to the truth and goodness that we want. Because when you're dealing with something like love, you can't know it. You can't have a representation of it. You can't put it into a category, because you could always doubt it. There's no physical proof of it in the world that you could observe empirically. You have to have faith in love as a metaphysical unity. And that might be necessary for a genuine morality. It just might.